A young girl walks to church every day and refuses to leave. When the priest decides to follow her, he discovers a secret that leaves him stunned. Dawson, an old town nestled in the hills, awoke to a thick morning fog as autumn's chill swept dry leaves down its cobbled streets. The locals, going about their daily routines, were unaware of the mystery hidden within the church's weathered walls. The slow tolling of bells at dawn marked the beginning of another day, seemingly like any other. But for Father Thomas, this day was anything but ordinary. For weeks now, the girl with sad, dark eyes had been appearing at church each morning. Young Emily, barely 11, had become a constant yet unsettling presence in the parish. She arrived at dawn, her small figure hunched under an oversized coat, her footsteps barely audible in the empty church. She never spoke to anyone, nor did she smile. She simply walked to the first pew in front of the altar, sat down, hands clasped tightly together as though in prayer, though her lips remained closed. Father Thomas, who had served in the parish for over a decade, had never seen anything like it. Initially, he thought the girl sought comfort, perhaps divine guidance for some recent loss. It wasn't unusual for people, even children, to come to the church during times of sorrow. But there was something unsettling about Emily's gaze, the way her eyes stayed fixed on the wooden cross hanging over the altar, as though awaiting a message, a word only she could understand. Each day, after morning mass, the church gradually emptied. Parishioners left with their usual murmurs, and Father Thomas returned to his daily tasks. But Emily remained, ignoring farewells, oblivious to the conversations swirling around her. She seemed to exist in a bubble of solitude, unreachable even by the kindest townsfolk, who had started to notice her behavior. The older ladies, ever observant of the goings-on around them, soon began whispering about the girl. They chatted in the market, at street corners, under archways, remarking on how the youngest child of the Parkers, orphaned just a year ago, spent her days before the altar, as if life were something no longer hers. Some speculated she'd lost her mind. Others said she was praying for her parents, who had died in a car accident, to be released from purgatory. "It's strange, isn't it?" said Mrs. Angela to her neighbor one day as they left the church. "So young, yet with such deep sorrow. Something must have happened to her." But no one knew for sure what was going on with Emily, not even her grandmother, Mrs. Beatrice, who was now her only living family. The elderly woman, weighed down by her age and the fresh bitterness of grief, rarely left her house and spoke little of the tragedy that had shattered her family. To the townspeople, Emily had become a shadow, a reflection of that family sorrow they preferred to avoid. Father Thomas, however, could not look away. Each passing day, Emily's presence unsettled him more deeply. He felt responsible for her, though he didn't know why. Perhaps it was his duty as a priest, or perhaps there was something in her hollow gaze that reminded him of his own childhood, of the dark days when death lingered around his home, and he, as a young boy, had sought refuge in vain in the church. Whatever it was, he decided to reach out to Emily and offer his help. But each time he tried, she closed herself off even more. One Friday afternoon, after evening mass, he decided to try again. The pews were empty, and the last rays of sunlight filtered through the stained glass, casting warm hues across the church's cold interior. Emily, as always, was in her place, so still that her breathing was almost imperceptible. "Emily," Father Thomas called, standing at a respectful distance. "May I sit with you?" The girl didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the altar, as though the priest's words hadn't reached her. He took a few steps closer, his robe faintly brushing against the stone floor. Sitting beside her carefully, he tried not to invade her space. "I know you're going through something very hard," he continued, keeping his voice as gentle as possible. "You don't have to carry it all alone, Emily. I'm here to help if you need." Emily blinked slowly but did not look at him. There was something about her that made him increasingly uneasy, as if she were trapped far away, caught in a trance she couldn't escape. "Sometimes, pain can make us feel like we're alone," Father Thomas continued, though he sensed his words only scratched the surface. "But we aren't. God is always with us, and we are here with you, too." Suddenly, the girl spoke. It was a whisper so faint the priest almost missed it. "I can't break the promise," she said, her voice trembling with an emotion he couldn't fully identify. "I can't, or everything will get worse." Father Thomas's heart skipped. What promise? What was she talking about? Before he could ask, Emily abruptly stood and ran out of the church, her small footsteps echoing across the stone floor like a sound of desperation. He watched her disappear through the large doors, a sense of bewilderment settling over him long after the sun had set. That night, Father Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat in the shadows of his study, surrounded by the parish library's books, Emily's image lingering in his mind. What promise was she keeping? What could drive a young girl into such despair? He knew something darker lurked behind her words, something even faith couldn't easily unravel. And so he made a decision. He had to do something. He couldn't sit back and watch Emily collapse under the weight of her silence. With the determination of one who knows he's about to confront an uncomfortable truth, Father Thomas resolved to speak with Mrs. Beatrice the next day. Emily couldn't bear this burden alone, and he had to uncover the truth behind her silence. Something terrible was haunting Emily, and he was determined to find out what it was, even if it meant facing his own fears. Dawson awoke to yet another morning, witnessing once more Emily's return to the church. She had fled the day before, leaving Father Thomas full of worry and questions. But her return to the sanctuary was no surprise. It was as if something compelled the girl back to the altar, to the figure of the crucified Christ. From the sacristy, Father Thomas watched her faltering steps, her lost gaze, and her small body wrapped in the heavy silence that seemed to follow her everywhere. She'd taken her usual place in the first pew, still as ever, though something was different today. Her posture was more rigid, as though an internal struggle was consuming her. Father Thomas knew he could no longer stand by as a mere observer. He'd decided the previous night, in the solitude of his study, that he had to act. Emily couldn't remain lost in the darkness of her silence. That morning, he resolved to speak with Mrs. Beatrice, Emily's grandmother. The elderly woman was her only family, and though she rarely left her house, she had to have some answers. What did she know of the promise Emily had mentioned? What burden was weighing on the girl's shoulders? With a sense of unease, Father Thomas braced himself for a difficult conversation. Since Emily's parents had passed, her grandmother had become completely reclusive. The path to Mrs. Beatrice's house wasn't far, but to Father Thomas, each step felt as though it drew him deeper toward a truth that could change everything. The cold autumn wind swirled dry leaves around his feet, as if nature itself were whispering warnings. Finally, he stopped before the modest Parker home. The small house, with its white walls and time-worn windows, looked as tired as the woman who lived inside. He knocked gently on the wooden door. After several moments, he heard the sound of slow footsteps from within. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Beatrice, who seemed to have aged a decade since he'd last seen her. Her white hair was disheveled, her eyes dark and sunken, yet still retaining a glimmer of clarity. "Father Thomas," she greeted, her voice laden with weariness and something else he couldn't quite identify. "Mrs. Beatrice, I apologize for the early visit, but I need to talk to you about Emily," he said, striving to keep his tone soft. She gestured for him to come in. He noted how the inside of the house reflected its owner's state. Dusty, dark, with old furniture seemingly abandoned to time. The table in the center of the small room was cluttered with crumpled papers and scattered items, as if life had ceased to flow in that place since the tragedy. They sat on a worn-out sofa, facing a closed window that let in no sunlight. The silence in the house was thick, oppressive, and Father Thomas couldn't help but feel the presence of lingering sorrow. "Emily," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I know it's been hard on her since her parents passed, but there's something more, something that's consuming her, and I think it has to do with a promise. She mentioned it herself, though I don't know what she meant. I'm very worried, Mrs. Beatrice." The elderly woman closed her eyes for a moment, as if the weight of his words was too much to bear. Then, slowly, she spoke in a barely audible voice. "The promise," she echoed. She hasn't spoken about it to me. I didn't know. Father Thomas noticed her hands trembling. Something was wrong. Perhaps she wasn't fully aware of everything. But there was a truth hidden beneath her fatigue and sorrow. She must be carrying something heavy, he said, trying to stay calm. Maybe something that happened before the accident. Or that night. Something that makes her feel responsible. Mrs. Beatrice sighed deeply, her eyes filled with an unbreakable sadness. That night, her parents argued. She finally revealed, her voice fading with each word. They argued over something important. It was a promise they made, not to Emily, but to each other. Father Thomas frowned. A promise between Emily's parents? The mystery deepened with each new detail. I don't know exactly what happened, she continued. Emily was very close to her father, and I believe that night, something in their argument affected her deeply. But I don't know what he might have said, or what's making her carry this burden. Her words lingered in the air, the echo of an incomplete story. Father Thomas felt they were getting closer to something crucial, though he still didn't have enough pieces of the puzzle. I need to talk to her, the elderly woman said suddenly. But she doesn't talk to me, Father. Since the accident, Emily has built a wall around herself, and I don't know how to break it down. The priest felt the pain in her voice, understanding that Emily's isolation affected more than just herself. It was also tearing apart those around her. Emily's silence weighed heavily on her grandmother, too. Father Thomas knew the solution wouldn't be simple, but he sensed the key was in understanding what had happened that night. I'll speak with Emily again, he assured the grandmother, rising. But I need you to try to reach her too, with patience. Maybe together, we can help her free herself from whatever is tormenting her. Mrs. Beatrice nodded slowly, but her face showed little hope. To her, Emily had become a ghost, a shadow that barely moved between the walls of the house and the church, lost in a world the grandmother could not reach. As Father Thomas left the house, the gray sky over Dawson seemed to mirror the weight of that morning's revelations. He felt he was closer to understanding the source of Emily's anguish, but he also knew he had to proceed with caution. The girl was in a fragile state, and any wrong move could cause her to withdraw even further into her pain. The wind blew stronger as he walked back to the church. The sound of the noonday bells echoed in the distance, while the town continued its ordinary life, unaware of the emotional storm surrounding Emily and her grandmother. Entering the sanctuary, he saw the girl still in her usual place, motionless before the altar. He sat on the pew behind her, observing her in silence for a moment. Then, in a gentle voice, he spoke her name. Emily. This time the girl didn't run. She slowly turned her head, and her dark eyes, filled with overwhelming sadness, met the priest's. In that moment, Father Thomas knew that the next step couldn't be forced. Emily wasn't ready to tell him everything, but at least she had begun to respond, and that, though small, was a step forward. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, and that something terrible was about to be revealed. Father Thomas couldn't shake the image of Emily from his mind all day. The girl's eyes, brimming with endless sorrow, seemed to hold more than the simple grief of losing her parents. There was something deeper there, something dark, hidden in her prolonged silences and evasive responses. Mrs. Beatrice's words about the promise, combined with Emily's reaction, only intensified the priest's unease. That night, as the town of Dawson settled into the quiet of the early hours, Father Thomas walked alone through the empty church. Candles flickered in the cold draft that slipped through the windows, casting restless shadows along the stone walls. In his mind, Emily's face appeared again and again. He knew he couldn't ignore what he had heard that morning. The promise, the guilt consuming the girl. It all pointed to the same night, the tragic accident that had claimed her parents' lives. The priest had tried countless times to approach Emily, each attempt ending with her fleeing from the church or responding with an eerie silence. But now he couldn't keep waiting. He felt that the weight she bore was becoming unbearable, and that if he didn't act soon, Emily might be lost in her grief forever. That same night, he made a risky decision. He decided to stay in the church, hidden in a dark corner near the altar, to observe Emily when she thought herself alone. This wasn't his usual approach, but he felt there was no longer time for subtlety. He needed to understand what was tormenting her. Emily had mentioned a promise she couldn't break, and Father Thomas feared that the weight of it was pushing her towards something dangerous. The hours passed slowly. The church was shrouded in an unsettling dimness, broken only by the gentle flicker of the candles. Hidden behind a column near the altar, Father Thomas waited patiently, knowing that Emily would arrive, as she did every night after everyone had left. Finally, the church door creaked open, and Emily's small steps echoed through the empty temple. She entered like a ghost, her figure cloaked in darkness, moving with a familiarity that evidenced her constant visits. She wore the same gray dress, her hands pressed to her chest as if trying to contain something that threatened to overflow. The girl walked slowly to the front pew, her usual place. Kneeling before the altar, she fixed her eyes on the wooden cross, and for a moment, silence reigned. Father Thomas held his breath, waiting, watching with a pounding heart. Suddenly, Emily broke the silence. She began to speak, but she wasn't praying. Her words were low whispers, barely audible from where he hid, yet clear enough for him to understand she wasn't alone in her mind. The girl was speaking as if addressing someone invisible. "Forgive me," murmured Emily, her voice trembling with an emotion Father Thomas had never heard from her. "I can't break the promise. I just can't." Father Thomas's heart raced. Who did Emily think she was talking to? What promise was she keeping that held her in this state of constant anguish? Emily continued, her voice breaking more with each word. "Dad, Mom, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have insisted on coming back. I shouldn't have asked you to return." Father Thomas felt the air leave his chest. Finally, he was beginning to understand. Emily wasn't simply grieving her parents' death. She was carrying a guilt that wasn't hers. She was blaming herself for the accident. "If I hadn't insisted, if we'd waited just a little longer, you'd be here," she sobbed, her hands gripping the edge of the pew before her. "It's my fault." A wave of compassion and despair washed over Father Thomas. Emily was trapped in a spiral of guilt, destroying herself. The accident that took her parents hadn't been merely a tragedy to her. It had become a condemnation she believed she had caused. That was why she kept coming to the church, trying to atone for a guilt no one else saw, a guilt that existed only in her broken heart. The priest knew in that moment he had to intervene. He couldn't let Emily continue to believe she was responsible for her parents' death. Without further hesitation, he rose from his hiding spot and walked toward her, his steps soft but resolute. "Emily," he called in a low voice, firm enough for her to hear. Emily startled. Realizing she wasn't alone, she jumped up, her eyes wide with panic. She backed away several steps, like a frightened animal, her breath quickening. "No," she stammered, her eyes darting around for an escape. "No, you can't be here." "Emily, please listen," said Father Thomas, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to scare you. I just want to talk." "No, you can't," she repeated, becoming more and more agitated. Her eyes filled with tears, and before the priest could get any closer, she turned on her heel and ran out of the church. Father Thomas watched her vanish into the night's darkness, his heart heavy with helplessness. He had tried to help her but had failed. Emily was more frightened than ever, and now she would likely close herself off even more. But he couldn't give up. Now he knew that Emily believed she was to blame for her parents' death, and he couldn't let that false guilt consume her. He stood there, in the center of the empty church, feeling as though time was running out. The guilt Emily bore was far too heavy for such a young girl, and if he didn't find a way to release her from it soon, he feared Emily might do something irreversible. That night, as he knelt before the altar, praying for guidance, Father Thomas realized he was facing a struggle he couldn't fight alone. He needed help, but he also knew that, in the end, only Emily could free herself from the promise that bound her to her pain. And the haunting question that lingered in his mind was this: what promise was it that the girl felt she couldn't break? Father Thomas could not sleep that night. The echoes of Emily's sobs replayed in his mind like a haunting melody he could not ignore. The image of her fleeing, terrified, left him with a sense of helplessness. He knew he needed to do more, but the path forward was unclear. Emily was trapped in a self-destructive guilt, and he feared that if he didn't act soon, it might be too late to save her. The next morning, the priest rose early, more determined than ever. He had spent the night praying for guidance, and while he hadn't found all the answers, he knew one thing. He had to learn more about the accident that had taken Emily's parents. Somewhere in that tragedy, in the days surrounding it, might lie the seed of the guilt the girl bore. He decided to begin his search at the church. He knew the accident had taken place outside town on a deserted road, but the details had been hazy in the murmurings of the congregation. Maybe someone had seen something, some detail that Emily had kept silent. Father Thomas needed to discover what had made her feel responsible. After morning mass, he approached Mrs. Angela, one of the oldest parishioners and a woman who was usually aware of everything happening in town. If anyone knew more about the accident, it would be her. Mrs. Angela, I was wondering if you recall anything else about the accident involving Emily's parents, he asked casually as she adjusted her shawl over her shoulders. Perhaps something that was mentioned among the neighbors at the time? The woman frowned, trying to remember. Oh, Father, of course I remember that tragedy. It was awful. We all felt it deeply, she said in a low voice, as if afraid to speak too loudly on the topic. The accident happened on the main road near the old bridge. They were coming back from the city that night, and the fog was so thick you could barely see a thing. Some say a large truck forced them off the road. Others think the driver might have been drunk. The priest nodded, processing the information. But none of it explained Emily's guilt. He needed more. Was there anything unusual about that trip? Anything Emily might have mentioned to someone? He pressed, hoping for a loose thread. Mrs. Angela thought for a moment, her wrinkled eyes searching her memory. Well, now that you mention it, I did hear something about an argument before they left the city. I don't know if it was at a relative's house or a restaurant, but it seems there was some disagreement that night, though I wouldn't know what it was about. Father Thomas's pulse quickened. Could that argument be the root of Emily's guilt? Something had happened before they got in the car, and that argument might be the key. Perhaps the girl believed she had somehow set off the events that led to the accident. Thank you, Mrs. Angela, said the priest with a slight, forced smile. This may be important in helping Emily. Without wasting time, Father Thomas returned to the church, determined to wait for Emily once more. He knew she would come, as she always did, at the end of the day. This time, however, he wouldn't hide. He had to find a way to reach her without frightening her. Perhaps the only way to do so was to speak directly, without beating around the bush, to confront her with the reality that none of this was her fault. The day passed slowly, but as evening fell, the church filled once again with the autumn chill seeping through the window cracks. The usual silence enveloped the place, and Emily's small figure appeared again, shuffling towards the altar as if following a ritual she couldn't break. Father Thomas observed her from a safe distance before taking a step forward. Emily, please, don't run this time, he said in a gentle yet firm voice, hoping to avoid a repeat of the night before. Emily froze, her entire body tensing, but she didn't run. Her shoulders shook slightly, and her breathing was fast, as if bracing herself for a confrontation. I only want to help you, Emily. I know you believe all of this is your fault, but it isn't. What happened that night was an accident. You are not to blame, he said, taking another step closer, trying to calm her fears. Emily pressed her lips together tightly, her eyes fixed on the ground. For a moment, it seemed she wouldn't answer. Then, she spoke, but her words were filled with a pain so deep it made the priest shudder. You don't understand, she whispered, barely audible. If I hadn't asked to go home so early, they wouldn't have argued. If I hadn't insisted on leaving, they'd be alive. Father Thomas felt everything click into place. The argument Mrs. Angela had mentioned. Emily, tired of being out, had begged to return home earlier than planned, and that request had sparked a disagreement. In her young mind, that made her responsible for the accident. This was the broken promise that haunted her. "Emily, what happened was a tragedy, but it wasn't your fault," insisted the priest, taking another step closer. "What you said that night didn't cause the accident. It was an accident, my dear. Something no one could have prevented." Emily began to cry, but not violently. These were silent tears, the kind that fall when there is no more strength to fight the pain. Her small body shook as the tears flowed down her cheeks, and Father Thomas felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. At least, Emily was finally releasing some of the weight that had been crushing her. "They loved you, Emily, and nothing that happened that night changes that. They wouldn't want to see you suffering like this, burdened by something that wasn't your fault." Silence filled the space between them, and the priest's words hung in the cool air of the church. Emily, still crying, sank onto the pew, too drained to remain standing. Father Thomas moved slowly to sit beside her, saying nothing more, simply offering his presence. He knew that, at that moment, there was nothing else he could say. She needed time to process the storm of emotions within her. Minutes passed, and the priest remained at her side, unmoving, until finally her tears slowed. Her sobs became deep breaths, and the trembling in her body began to subside. "I want you to talk to me when you're ready," said Father Thomas softly, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to carry this alone." Emily didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either. The priest knew this was a small victory. He had managed to take a first step, a crack in the wall of pain and guilt she had built around herself. Yet there was still much work to be done. Emily needed to fully understand that she was not to blame and that the promise she thought she had broken was not what she believed. As Father Thomas rose to leave her alone for a moment, he wondered if he could go far enough to free Emily from the guilt that was drowning her. And deep in his heart, he feared what might happen if he couldn't. The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension in the church. Emily continued attending, but something had shifted. Though her routine remained the same, entering early, sitting in the front pew, and staying silent for hours, Father Thomas noticed a subtle change in her demeanor. She was no longer the frozen figure of before. While still consumed by sadness, Emily seemed on the edge of something. The priest could sense it in the air. She was beginning to face her pain, though the road to healing would be long. Father Thomas stayed close, attentive to any sign that Emily might want to talk. He knew he couldn't rush her. Forcing her would only drive her back into her silence. He had managed to open a small window in the wall she had built around herself, and he needed to be patient. He also knew the key to helping her lay in fully understanding the promise she had mentioned. Something was still missing. One afternoon, as Emily sat in the church, Father Thomas quietly joined her. He didn't ask anything. He simply sat beside her, offering his presence. After a long while, it was Emily who broke the silence. "It was my fault," she said suddenly, her voice soft but clear. Her eyes remained fixed on the wooden cross, and her words spilled from her heart like small confessions, releasing a heavy burden she had been carrying. "If I hadn't insisted, they'd still be here." The priest listened silently, waiting for her to continue. He knew he shouldn't interrupt her. "My parents wanted to stay in the city longer. They were going to renew their wedding vows at the church." Her voice cracked as she said this, as if the mere mention of the broken promise split her in two. "It was important to them, but I was tired. I wanted to go home. I kept telling them I was bored, that I didn't want to stay any longer." Emily closed her eyes tightly, as if the memories were hitting her with painful force. "They argued because of me. They were angry with each other, and with me. My mom said it didn't matter if we went back that night, that we could go the next day, but my dad insisted. He wanted to keep the promise that night. But Her voice trailed off, trembling with pain. "I didn't want to." Father Thomas felt a pang in his heart as he listened. Emily had been carrying this burden all along, convinced that her impatience and insistence had caused the accident. In her young mind, the argument between her parents and the decision to go home early due to her pressure made her feel responsible. That's when it happened. The accident, Emily continued, her tears finally breaking free. "If I hadn't asked to leave, they would have renewed their vows. They would have kept their promise, and they'd still be alive. The silence in the church was overwhelming, broken only by Emily's soft sobs. Father Thomas understood now that Emily wasn't only grieving her parents' death, but also felt as if she had kept them from fulfilling a sacred promise. A renewal of love that had been shattered forever. "Emily," said Father Thomas, his voice low but steady, "your parents loved you deeply. They wanted you to be happy. There was nothing you could have done or said that would have changed what happened. It was an accident, something beyond our control. You cannot carry that weight." Emily finally looked at him, her red-rimmed eyes showing both deep despair and a desperate longing to be freed from this unbearable pain. "But the promise," she whispered, "they never got to fulfill it. I took that from them." The priest understood that, for Emily, the broken promise was both emotional and spiritual. She didn't just feel guilty about the accident. She also believed that she had prevented her parents from sharing one last act of love. To Emily, she had failed to let her parents have that final connection, and that was the promise she thought she had broken. With a heavy heart, Father Thomas knew words alone wouldn't be enough to erase this belief from Emily's mind. She needed something more, something to give her peace and show her that she wasn't responsible. She needed to hear from her parents in a way that would reassure her that the promise tormenting her was not what she thought. With this idea in mind, the priest decided he needed to speak with Mrs. Beatrice again. He remembered that Emily's grandmother had once mentioned a letter written by Emily's parents shortly before the accident, but she had never wanted to show it to anyone. Perhaps that letter contained the words Emily needed to hear. That afternoon, as the church emptied and evening shadows began creeping across the walls, Father Thomas headed back to Mrs. Beatrice's house. The air was cold, and the solitude of the streets made the journey feel long and heavy. He knocked gently, and after a few moments, the elderly woman opened the door, her expression wearier than usual. "Father Thomas, has something happened with Emily?" she asked, her face tense with worry. "Mrs. Beatrice, I spoke with Emily. She told me about the promise that's haunting her, and I've come to understand a deeper layer of her pain," he said, stepping into the house. "You once mentioned a letter her parents wrote before the accident. I believe that letter could hold the key to helping her. She needs to know what her parents thought before everything happened." The elderly woman fell silent for a moment. Her eyes darkened, clouded with a memory she had avoided confronting. She walked slowly to an old wooden chest and, after a few moments, retrieved a small, rusted tin box. She opened it with trembling hands and took out a carefully folded sheet of paper, handing it to the priest with a resigned look. "I wasn't sure if I should ever show this to her," Mrs. Beatrice confessed. "I didn't want the letter to cause her more pain, but perhaps it's what she needs." Father Thomas took the letter gently, understanding that its words could hold the power to release Emily from the darkness she'd carried for so long. "Thank you, Mrs. Beatrice," he said, tucking the letter into his pocket. "This may be what finally brings her peace." Returning to the church, Father Thomas paused in the dim interior, gazing at the altar in silence. He knew that sharing this letter with Emily would be a turning point, one that could either break her or set her free. But he had to try. Emily deserved to know what her parents had thought and felt before the tragedy had separated them forever. He understood that the young girl was facing her worst fear, the fear of not having been enough, of having failed those she loved most. With the letter, he hoped to show her that her parents' love for her was unconditional, and that, even after all that had happened, that love remained alive in her memory. The candlelight flickered gently in the church, a small reflection of the hope that still burned in Father Thomas's heart. The small letter, carefully folded in Father Thomas's pocket, weighed more than anything he had ever carried. As he walked slowly back to the church, each step felt heavy with the responsibility he bore. This piece of paper might contain the words that would finally free Emily from the devastating guilt consuming her. He knew he needed to proceed with both caution and strength. Emily had to know what her parents truly felt before that tragic night. When he arrived at the church, darkness had already fallen over Dawson. The flickering candlelight cast unsettling shadows across the stone walls, filling the air with a sense that something significant was about to unfold. Emily was there as always, sitting in the front pew. Her small figure seemed even more fragile under the soft glow that wrapped around the space. Father Thomas approached slowly, holding the letter in his hands. Emily didn't move. There was a calm uneasiness about her, as though she were waiting for something without knowing what. "Emily," Father Thomas began gently, "your parents left something for you? Something I believe will help you understand that what happened was not your fault." The girl turned her head slowly to look at him, her dark eyes weary and confused. She didn't speak, but her gaze told him she was willing to listen, at least for that moment. That was all he needed. Sitting beside her, he carefully unfolded the letter. The thin sheet of paper rustled softly in his hands. The silence in the church was absolute, broken only by Emily's quiet breathing. Father Thomas began to read in a low but clear voice. "Dear Emily, we are writing this to you because, though we don't know when you'll read it, we want you to know how much we love you. This weekend is very special for us. We are going to renew our wedding vows, and we want you to know that you are the reason our family is so strong, so full of love. We've faced difficult times, but we've always found strength in you. Watching you grow, seeing you become the wonderful girl you are, fills us with pride. Nothing in this world could ever change how we feel about you. We want you to know that, no matter what happens, we will always be with you. No matter where we are, our hearts will always be beside you. You are our greatest treasure, and everything we do is for you and because of you. We love you more than words can say, and we would never want you to carry any burden that isn't yours. With all our love, Mom and Dad." The words lingered in the air, filling the space with a warmth that seemed almost tangible. Emily didn't move. She remained silent as Father Thomas carefully folded the letter once more. There were tears in her eyes, but they weren't the same tears of anguish as before. These tears were gentler, born from the love she felt in her parents' words, a love that had always been there, though she had forgotten it in her grief. "They didn't want you to carry this, Emily," Father Thomas said in a calming voice. "They wanted you to be happy, to live your life without that weight. Their promise wasn't just between themselves. It was with you too. They always wanted you to know how much they loved you." Emily clutched her hands tightly in her lap, her breathing uneven as she absorbed what she had just heard. The letter, written before the accident, was telling her something she hadn't been able to accept until now. That her parents would never blame her for what happened and that their love remained unconditional, even in their absence. "But I insisted," she whispered, her voice trembling with guilt. "If I hadn't insisted on going back, if I hadn't been so selfish." Father Thomas gently shook his head, interrupting her thoughts. "You weren't selfish, Emily. You were a tired child who wanted to go home. That's normal. What happened after wasn't your fault. It was a tragedy, but it wasn't caused by you. Your parents would never have blamed you, and they wouldn't want you to blame yourself." Emily bowed her head, her tears falling silently onto her hands. But Father Thomas could see that something within her had shifted. The words in the letter had begun to break the invisible chains that had bound her for so long. It wasn't an instant transformation, but it was a beginning. She was starting to understand that her parents' love transcended the accident and that no promise had been broken. Her parents' promise of love was still alive within her, no matter what had happened that fateful night. For several minutes, they sat in silence, sharing a sacred moment in the dim light of the church. Father Thomas knew Emily needed time to process what she had just heard. He didn't push her. He simply sat beside her, allowing her to move at her own pace. Eventually, Emily lifted her gaze, and for the first time in a long while, her eyes weren't filled with despair. They were still sad, but there was a spark of understanding, a small light that hadn't been there before. "Do you think they forgave me?" she asked, her voice still fragile but steadier than before. Father Thomas smiled gently, feeling a deep sense of relief. "You don't need their forgiveness, Emily, because you were never at fault. But I'm sure they would want you to forgive yourself." Emily stayed silent, absorbing his words. She knew the path to forgiving herself wouldn't be easy, but now, at least, she could see it. The weight that had crushed her young heart for so long was beginning to lift, even if only a little. That night, when Emily finally stood to leave, she did so without running, without the urgency of someone fleeing from her own ghosts. Father Thomas watched her walk out of the church, knowing that this was the first step toward her healing. There was still much to do, but now there was hope. Emily had started to see the truth behind the tragedy, and though the pain remained, it no longer consumed her as it once had. The priest lingered in the church long after Emily left, praying silently. He knew that the journey wasn't over, but he was certain that he had done the right thing by reading her the letter. He felt that, in some way, her parents had been there with him that night, helping their daughter release the weight she had carried for so long. As he stepped outside into the cold night air, it felt less oppressive than before. The stars shone brightly in the clear sky, and Father Thomas felt a calmness within that he hadn't experienced in a long time. The promise between Emily's parents hadn't been broken, because the love they shared lived on within her. And now, little by little, Emily would begin to understand that. But he knew there was still more to be done. Emily's healing journey had only just begun, and Father Thomas was prepared to guide her along the way, making sure she didn't fall back into the darkness of guilt. The following morning, as dawn's first light touched the old streets of Dawson, Father Thomas awoke with a renewed sense of hope. Though Emily was not yet entirely free from her guilt, reading her parents' letter had brought her a step closer to healing. The priest could see that, at last, she was beginning to believe that her pain was not a lifelong sentence. But he knew the journey was far from over. The wounds Emily carried were deep, and they wouldn't vanish with a single revelation. That day, he decided Emily's healing process needed something beyond words or confessions. She needed an act that would allow her to release all that she had held back for so long. It was then that an idea came to him, a risky one, but one that might bring a definitive change in her heart. After morning mass, he waited for Emily to arrive at the church, as she did each day. Her steps were still hesitant, but her posture no longer carried the same weight as before. Her eyes, though still touched with sadness, seemed to have found some relief. She sat in her usual spot at the front pew, and Father Thomas observed her quietly for a moment before sitting beside her. "Emily," he began softly, taking a seat next to her, "I've been thinking of something that might help you." She looked at him, her eyes filled with curiosity and a trace of caution. "Your parents were planning to renew their wedding vows, weren't they?" he asked, knowing this was a delicate subject but one they needed to confront. Emily nodded slightly, saying nothing. The memory of that unfulfilled promise still hurt. "I think we should do something to honor that promise," he continued. "Not as a way to make amends, because you know by now that none of what happened was your fault, but as a way to remember your parents, to celebrate the love they shared and all they meant to you. We could hold a small ceremony here in the church, something that lets you close that chapter in a different way. A way that allows you to move forward with them in your heart, but without the weight of the past." Emily frowned, puzzled. "A ceremony?" she asked softly. "But how would that change anything?" Father Thomas gave a gentle smile. He knew it sounded strange at first, but he believed Emily could find peace in a symbolic gesture. Something that would let her see that the promise had not been broken, only transformed. "We can't change what happened, Emily, but we can give it new meaning. Instead of focusing on what you think was left undone, you can choose to remember what your parents wanted for you. Happiness, peace, and love. This ceremony won't be for them. It will be for you. So you can close this chapter with peace in your heart, knowing they would be proud of you." Emily lowered her gaze, thoughtful. The idea of a ceremony felt overwhelming, yet there was something comforting in the suggestion. It felt as though she was being given a second chance, not to change the past, but to reconcile with it. "What would I have to do?" she finally asked, her voice soft but more assured than before. "Whatever feels right to you," the priest replied. "You could write them a letter, say a special prayer, or simply sit here before the altar and speak to them in your heart. What matters is that it's a moment of healing for you." Emily nodded slowly. Though the idea frightened her a bit, she felt it might be the closure she needed. The silence she had been trapped in was beginning to give way, and for the first time in months, she felt there was a way out, a way to move forward without the weight of guilt. "All right," she said softly but with a determination that surprised the priest. "I want to do it." Father Thomas smiled, relieved. He knew it wouldn't be easy for her, but the fact that she had agreed was already a huge step. "We'll do it tomorrow then," he said gently. "It will be a quiet moment, just for you. No one else needs to be here. It will be between you, your parents, and God." Emily nodded again, and though she said nothing else, the priest could see that something inside her was beginning to shift. The next day, the sun rose through soft clouds, casting a warm, golden light over the town. The church was empty except for Father Thomas and Emily, who had arrived early as usual. The atmosphere within the sanctuary was solemn yet peaceful, as though the space understood that something important was about to take place. Dressed in a simple white dress that Mrs. Beatrice had given her for the occasion, Emily approached the altar with slow but steady steps. Her hands trembled slightly, but her face was serene. She stopped before the large wooden cross, the same one she had stared at in silence for so many hours, and took a deep breath. Father Thomas, standing beside her, offered her an encouraging smile. "There's no rush, Emily," he said quietly. "Take as much time as you need." Emily nodded and took a small, folded piece of paper from her pocket. It was a letter she had written to her parents the night before, filled with the thoughts and feelings she had held inside for so long. With trembling hands, she placed the letter at the foot of the altar, as though offering it up to them. Then she closed her eyes and began to speak in a low, almost whispering voice, but each word was heavy with meaning. "Mom, Dad," she began, "I never got to say goodbye the way I wanted to. For so long, I thought it was my fault that you weren't here anymore. I thought I had disappointed you. But now I know that you always loved me, and that what happened wasn't because of me. I just want you to know that I will always remember you, not with sadness, but with love. And I will try to live my life the way you would have wanted, with no fear and no guilt. I know you'd be proud of me." Tears began to fall silently down Emily's cheeks, but this time they were not tears of despair. They were tears of release. With each word, it was as though she were letting go of the weight she had carried for so long. The priest, watching in silence, felt a profound peace settle over the church, as if Emily's parents' spirits were present, listening to their daughter. When she finished speaking, Emily remained kneeling before the altar for several minutes in silence. Father Thomas didn't interrupt her, sensing that this was a sacred moment for her. And though all her pain wouldn't vanish at once, this was the beginning of something new. A life without guilt. A life where she could remember her parents with love rather than sorrow. Finally, Emily rose, and the priest accompanied her to the door of the church. As they stepped outside, the sun shone brightly, casting a warm and comforting light over her face. "Thank you, Father," Emily said in a soft but steady voice. "I feel like everything is clearer now." The priest smiled and nodded. "This is just the beginning, Emily. The important thing is that you now know you don't have to carry that burden alone." Emily looked up at the sky, the cool autumn breeze brushing her face, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. She felt, in some way, that her parents were with her. Not in the sadness of the past, but in the light of the present. From that day on, Emily began to attend church not to pray for forgiveness, but to remember her parents with love and to find comfort in the faith they had taught her. Gradually, she rejoined the activities of the town, made new friends, and started to become the girl she had once been before the tragedy, albeit with a maturity that only deep pain could impart. Father Thomas watched her progress with quiet pride, knowing that, though Emily's healing wasn't complete, she was no longer the broken child he had met months earlier. The promise that had once tormented her had been fulfilled, not in the way she expected, but in a deeper, more spiritual sense. And with it, Emily had found the peace she so desperately needed. In the days following the small ceremony at the church, a visible change began to take shape in Emily. Although moments of sadness still shadowed her eyes now and then, they were no longer a constant presence haunting her. Her steps through Dawson streets grew lighter, and those who once watched her with worry noticed that she no longer carried the same broken expression. Yet, Father Thomas knew that true healing would take time. The journey had begun, but there was still work to be done. One afternoon, while Emily was helping her grandmother, Mrs. Beatrice, tend the small garden in the yard, Father Thomas decided to pay them a visit. He hadn't spoken with Emily's grandmother since the ceremony, and he felt it was important to see how both were navigating this new chapter. As he arrived at the house, he saw Emily kneeling among the flowers, focused on pulling out weeds. Father Thomas, Emily greeted him with a smile that surprised him with its natural warmth. "I'm helping my grandmother in the garden. I haven't done this in such a long time." Mrs. Beatrice appeared at the door, glancing affectionately at the priest. "It's a joy to see my granddaughter doing these things again," she said. Ever since everything happened, she'd lost interest in just about everything. "But thanks to you, Father, it seems like my Emily is finding her way back." Father Thomas shook his head gently. "It's not thanks to me, Mrs. Beatrice. Emily has been very brave. She's done the true work." The elderly woman smiled and went back inside, leaving Father Thomas and Emily alone in the garden. Father Thomas moved closer to Emily, who had resumed her work among the flowers, her hands diligent but gentle. "How have you been feeling since the ceremony?" he asked softly. Emily paused for a moment and looked up at him. "I feel better," she said, her voice steady yet reflective. "It's like now I can remember my parents without everything hurting so much. But," she hesitated, as though gathering her courage, "there are still days when the sadness feels too heavy, like I can't breathe. It's not the same as before, but there are times when it's still hard." Father Thomas nodded thoughtfully. He understood that Emily was still struggling, but the fact that she could acknowledge these feelings and speak of them openly was a significant step forward. "That's normal, Emily. Healing takes time. No one can expect everything to feel right all at once. What matters is that now you know you're not facing it alone. Your grandmother is here, and so am I," he said, reassuring her. "And your parents, though no longer physically present, will always be with you." Emily nodded, but a shadow crossed her eyes. "Sometimes I dream about them," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "In the dreams, everything is fine. They're here at home and we're a family again. But then I wake up." She paused, swallowing hard, and realized it was just a dream. "And it hurts." Father Thomas watched her with compassion. He knew that dreams could offer comfort but also stir up pain when it came to grieving. What Emily described was a common experience for those who had lost loved ones. The return to reality was often more painful than the dreams themselves. "It's normal to dream of them, Emily. It's your way of keeping their memory alive, and it's also a way for your heart to process what happened. You don't have to fear those dreams. In time, you'll come to see them as reminders of how much they loved you." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Father. I think I'm starting to understand." They sat together in silence for several moments, the gentle autumn breeze rustling the leaves, and the golden light of the setting sun wrapped the garden in a warm glow. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt less overwhelmed by her sadness. The pain was still there, but now there was also hope, and that was something she hadn't felt in months. That same evening, Emily returned to the church. Although she no longer went there every day, she felt the need to return that night. This time, it wasn't to pray for forgiveness. It was to find solace in the silence and the peace of a place that had once suffocated her with painful memories. Father Thomas was in his study when he saw her enter, but he didn't follow. He knew she needed this moment alone. Emily walked toward the altar where she usually sat but didn't take her seat this time. Instead of kneeling or sitting on the pew, she stood before the large wooden cross that hung at the center of the church. She gazed up at it with a calmness she hadn't felt before. No longer searching for answers in the silence, she was finding acceptance. After several minutes, Emily pulled a small piece of paper from her pocket. It was another letter, but this one wasn't addressed to her parents. It was a letter she had written to herself after her conversation with Father Thomas in the garden. She had penned it during a moment of reflection, and now, in the place that had meant so much to her, she felt she needed to read it aloud. "Dear Emily," she began in a whisper, her voice barely audible but firm. "You've been through so much. You've blamed yourself for something that wasn't your fault, and you've carried a pain that felt like it would never end. But I want you to know that you are strong. Mom and Dad would be proud of you. I want you to know that you don't have to carry this weight anymore. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be yourself. It's okay to feel sad sometimes, but it's also okay to be happy. And it's okay to move forward. You don't have to forget them to do that because they'll always be with you. I love you, Emily. Don't forget that." As she finished reading the letter, Emily felt an unexpected wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't as if all her pain had disappeared, but for the first time, she felt she could breathe. She felt that she had made peace not only with her parents but with herself. Folding the letter carefully, Emily slipped it back into her pocket and turned to leave the church. The cool night air greeted her as she stepped outside, and as she walked home, there was a gentle, genuine smile on her face. Father Thomas, who had watched from a distance, smiled to himself. He knew the journey wasn't over, but the transformation in Emily was undeniable. She had found something greater than forgiveness. She had found peace. And that peace, although fragile, was enough to sustain her in the days to come. As the stars began to light up the sky over Dawson, Father Thomas felt a profound sense of satisfaction. He knew Emily would still face difficult days, but he also knew that she now had the strength to face them. And with time, those difficult days would grow fewer and farther between. At last, Emily had found the moment of truth she had so desperately needed, and with it, the freedom to live without the chains of the past. The autumn sun shone brightly over Dawson, and dry leaves crunched underfoot as the townspeople went about their daily routines. For Emily, however, this day marked the true beginning of a new chapter. Although she still felt the absence of her parents, it was no longer a pain that crushed her. It had become a part of her, a reminder of what she had endured, but also of what she had overcome. With the support of her grandmother and Father Thomas, Emily had begun participating more in church activities. She made friends with other children in town, something she had once thought impossible. Her gaze, once empty, now held a blend of sadness and joy. And though complex, this mixture made her feel alive in a way she hadn't since the accident. One afternoon, while helping organize a small community gathering in the church courtyard, Emily found herself laughing with other children. It was a free, unburdened laugh, without the weight of guilt that had once haunted her. Father Thomas watched from afar, a smile spreading across his face as he saw her so full of life. This was the clearest sign yet that the pain that had trapped her for so long was finally loosening its grip. Mrs. Beatrice, who had also started to regain some of her former vitality, approached the priest, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Father, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for Emily," she said, her voice soft but steady. "She's changed so much. She's my granddaughter again." The priest smiled, shaking his head gently. "Emily has always been strong. She just needed to remember how to be herself again. And you've been just as important, Mrs. Beatrice. A grandmother's love is irreplaceable." Mrs. Beatrice nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. For her, watching her granddaughter bloom once more was the greatest gift she could have received. In that moment, they both understood that healing hadn't come only to Emily, but to her entire family. Several months later, Emily's life had transformed entirely. Instead of viewing the church as a place of sorrow, she now saw it as a refuge, a place of renewal. She continued to pray, but no longer seeking forgiveness. Instead, she offered prayers of gratitude, remembering her parents with love rather than pain. She knew they would always be with her, in every step she took. One Sunday morning after Mass, Father Thomas decided to organize a small celebration in honor of Emily's healing journey. Although it was an uncommon gesture, he felt that Emily deserved recognition for her courage and resilience. The community, which had quietly followed her journey, gathered to celebrate alongside her. Standing before the congregation in a simple white dress, Emily listened as Father Thomas spoke. "Today, we don't just celebrate Emily's recovery," he began warmly, "but the strength of love, the love of her parents, which lives on in her, and the love she has learned to accept, He smiled, his eyes bright with pride. Emily has shown us all that even in the darkest moments, there is always hope. The congregation applauded with affection, and the girl who had once been lost in silence and guilt now stood surrounded by supportive faces. Emily took a deep breath, looking out at everyone, and then spoke. "Thank you all for being here with me," she said softly. "I've learned that I don't have to forget my parents to move forward. They'll always be in my heart. And today I can say that I'm at peace." Father Thomas watched her with pride. He had witnessed Emily's pain from the beginning, and now he saw her reborn. He knew that though the journey had been long and difficult, Emily had finally found the most important forgiveness. Forgiveness for herself. As the ceremony ended, Emily walked out of the church hand in hand with her grandmother. The sun shone brightly in the sky, and a soft autumn breeze brushed her face. As she walked through the town, she felt the warmth of life around her. The murmurs of people, the laughter of children playing in the square. Everything seemed brighter, more alive. "Your mom and dad would be proud of you," Mrs. Beatrice said, giving her granddaughter's hand a gentle squeeze. Emily smiled, lifting her gaze to the sky, where clouds drifted slowly, as if in a quiet dance. She knew her parents were with her, not as a painful shadow of the past, but as a light guiding her toward a future full of possibilities. "I know, Grandma," she replied with a serene smile she hadn't felt in a long time. "And I'm proud of them, too." As they continued walking, Emily felt light and free. She knew there would be hard days and moments when the pain might return, but she also knew she now had the strength to face it. She had found her peace.